So the Tayahom is a community, a large community living on the plains of northeast India, whose language is no longer spoken as a mother tongue, survives in large numbers of manuscripts, and is still used both as a revival language and as a ritual language in certain rituals that maybe are being revitalized, recreated, reinvented, reorganized. A very different situation is that of the Tangsa or Tangsa Naga, also called Tangshang in Burma/Myanmar, who live basically next door to the Tayahoms. And there are places in northeast India where Ahom villages and Tangsa villages are right next to each other. And indeed the Ahoms pass through the territory where the Tangsa Naga now live in order to reach their home back in 1228, although perhaps in 1228 there were different people there. Now, this is a really complicated story. So back when I started researching on the Tangsa in 2006, I believed that Tangsa was a single language. It isn't. But it is still listed as a single language in most publications, and that's because increasingly language listing has come to be based on ISO codes, International Organization for Standardization codes, and these codes are themselves managed by an organization called Summer Institute of Linguistics, which is a Christian organization that does Bible translation, language development, literacy, and those kinds of things, as well as maintaining a list of languages, which is called the Ethnologue. Until last year, the Ethnologue was openly available for people to look at, but you now have to pay money to see it, I think. Now, part of the issue that we have here is that the Ethnologue adopted the Indian tribal grouping names as language names when it was first put together. And these Indian tribal grouping names were created back in the 1950s because the wide range of different groups that lived in this mountainous area were too many for administrators to deal with, and so they wanted to have a single term. It's all very complicated. The nearest relative to Tangsa is Nokte, and the boundary between Tangsa and Nokte isn't something that we can actually easily make. And together they are put into a group that is sometimes called Konyak or sometimes called Northern Naga. Konyak is the name of another language, and sometimes you might read the statement, Tangsa is a Konyak language. Actually, that is meaningless and almost offensive for members of the Tangsa community, because they'll say, well, we are not Konyaks, we are Tangsas, but Konyak is being used there both as a name for an artifact, which is a language subgroup, as well as the name for a particular language. If you haven't clearly followed what I've been saying for the last 2 minutes, don't worry, it's complicated. Okay, so here's a linguistic map of the languages that are called Naga. So you might not be able to immediately work this out, but on both sides of this map are two great rivers. On the right-hand side, the Chindwin, which flows from northern Burma down to meet the Irrawaddy somewhere near Bagan in Burma. And on the north side, a much, much larger river, the Brahmaputra, which is an enormously wide river and carrying huge amounts of water that runs from Tibet through the state of Assam into Bangladesh and West Bengal. But between those two rivers and the quite vast valleys that they make up, there are these mountains. And the mountainous areas are where these Naga groups live. And this map, made by Jamie Saul in 2005, or at least published in his book, divides these Naga groups into different groups. Now, the ones at the bottom side, the ones in yellow, green, pink, and purple, are languages which are very distantly related to the ones which are on the top right, ones which are in orange and red. Those ones on the top right all belong to this Northern Naga or Konyak group, and they can be demonstrated to be related to each other. And the biggest single ones within that are the ones on the far top right, which are named as Tangsa on the India side and Haimi on the Myanmar side, but this map was made before people on the Myanmar side decided to use the term Tangshan. But Tangshan on the Myanmar side includes Wancho, Nokte, Tutsa and Lazu, which are all regarded as separate tribes on the India side. How many languages are spoken there? Well, actually no one knows, because there are, within that Wancho, Nokte, Lazu, Tutsa, Haimi, Tangsa, whatever area, there would be well over 100 different varieties. Even within Tangsa and Haimi, there are 80, and some of these are completely mutually intelligible and some of them unintelligible. Okay, so there's a lot we don't know about that situation. Here's just some pretty photos to give you an idea of the situation. So the Tangsa people traditionally lived in hills, but many of them have migrated down into the plains. And so this is a photo taken from Neotan village, where you can see the mountains that form the border with Myanmar and China in the distance. Here is a dance troupe from Neotan village of the Mashaung subtribe. I should have changed the spelling of that because that's been altered a few times. We're now spelling Muishaung, and when we're just writing the name, we're leaving off the X that is a marker of tone. But this is the Sapolo dance group led by the lady on the left, who is the mother of my principal consultant there. And here are three Ngaimong elders. Now, these three elders had come together to explain the history and culture of the Ngaimong, one of the Tangsa subtribes, Mashaung being another one. And Ngaimong and Mashaung languages are not exactly mutually intelligible. They can partly but not fully understand each other. Anyway, these three elders gathered to, for the one on the left, to make a long recording, lasted well over several hours, in fact, in multiple sections, where he explained the story of the festivals in that community. And the guy on the right, he's the one on the left, the one on the right gave a sort of simultaneous explanation, well, not simultaneous, but after he explained each portion, the guy on the right explained the meaning to us in English. What's interesting here is that the guy on the right is also a senior elder of the local Presbyterian church, and this was done on a Sunday night after church, and he changed his clothes from his pants and suit that he would wear to church into more traditional clothes. But even though he is a very devout and committed Christian, he's also nevertheless equally interested in his own traditional culture. Here is a photo of the Chindwin River on a foggy morning at Singaling Kamti on the Burma side. And here is the Kukevasor dance troupe, and if there's time later, you'll get to see them. This is the Yongkon group of Tangsa or Tangshan. Their language is totally different from the Mashaung and the Ngaimong. The Mashaung and the Ngaimong will be able to understand something of each other, but they won't understand anything that the Yongkon speak about. So this is not one language, this is many. Another feature of researching these people is that on both sides of the border, different families belonging to the same subtribe are present. So here we have two older men and a group of youngsters from the Maitai and Shetju subtribes. The Shetju language is a bit of a lingua franca in some areas, but is quite different from Maitai. And Shetju people generally don't understand Maitai people, but the other way around is true, because Shetju is a kind of a language of wider communication in some areas. And here I'm playing a recording that is being made by a very distant relative of the man with white hair, which he is now listening to. But he hasn't seen his relative for many years because crossing the Burma or Myanmar-India border is a difficult thing to do. Okay, so I've mentioned this before. There's a multitude of names. Naga is a cultural term that most but not all Tangsa are happy with. Northern Naga or Konyak is a linguistic subgroup, but Konyak is also the name of one of the tribes within that group, so that is a problematic name, but you will still find it. 4 groups are accepted as separate tribes in India: Tangsa, Nokte, Wancho, and since 2004 Tutsa, and each is regarded as a single language with an ISO code. Tangshang, on the other hand, a Burmese term adopted in 2003, more or less replacing Haimi, appears to subsume all the 4 languages on the India side. Together they account for somewhere in excess of 80 identifiable language varieties. So 80 different ways of speaking, some of which are completely mutually intelligible with the next village or with another group, and some of which are completely unintelligible. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the Shetu. The Shetu can completely 100% understand the Chamchang. The Chamchang and the Shetu came originally from villages that were close to each other. There are differences between them, but they are completely mutually intelligible. We would have no difficulty calling them dialects. However, the Shetu and Chamchang together will have more difficulty understanding a Maitai person, and they will not be able to understand a Yonkan person at all. And yet, for the moment, all of these are included under a single language label. So how many languages are there? How can we say? The average population of each of these groups is probably somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. So they are, in a sense, all endangered. So here's some background. We have within these 80 groups, or sub-tribes as I've come to call them, and this term is not in any sense pejorative or problematic for people in India or Burma that I've ever spoken to. Each sub-tribe has its own linguistic form, but there is a second system across them, which is a clan system. And the clans, so for example, the Kelim clan or Kelum clan, or even Kalum clan, can be found in different sub-tribes who do not speak the same variety, but they are the same clan. And that clan, you cannot marry someone within your clan. If you live in a small village where everyone belongs to the same clan, then you can't marry someone from that village. And you may end up marrying someone from a different sub-tribe who speaks a different language. And this leads to what we call linguistic exogamy, marrying someone outside your sub-tribe. Sometimes when people do that, they change their identity. They shift from one village to another and become something else. So, for example, in one of the Chamchang villages that I have done research in northeast India, there is a family of Kalak people. The Chamchang word for Kalak is Kilak, so they now call themselves Kilak because they only speak Kilak or Kalak, they only speak Chamchang language, which other people call Gimsing, but that's another problem. And this Kilak family have recently, just in the last couple of weeks, the old uncle of this family, the last person in that village who could speak some Kalak language, has passed away. And so now the Kalak people, now calling themselves Kilak, who live in that village, have all become Chamchang. The late Sir Edmund Leach wrote a book 50 years ago, Political Systems of Highland Burma, in which he talked about people becoming something else. So Shans becoming Kachins, Kachins becoming Shans, etc. This is what happens. You move to a different area, you become something else. The migration patterns, so they all have a group migration story coming from what is now China. They all have, or at least the ones that I have researched, have a story of dividing into groups when crossing the Tanai River, which is upstream of the Chindwin at the photo that I showed you from Khamti before. And from there they went up into the mountains and diversified into what they are now. And then over time they have migrated into India. The Tikak group of Tangsa people maybe 300 years or more ago. The Mashang and Chuklai at least 150 years, other groups more recently. And they are still doing it. So the traditional pattern of language usage was something that we call lingua receptiva or lingua receptiva, if you want to do a traditional Latin pronunciation. The language of reception. Everybody speaks their own variety but understands the variety of those in nearby villages. So if for example, a Shetu and a Maitai person were to meet up, both can understand each other's varieties, or believe they can, or say they can. Not that this is ever tested, but probably they can. And they speak their own variety and the other person speaks back. There is, however, a common song language, which is the same for all. But younger people are unable to do either of these things. They can't understand the other varieties, and the song language is passing out of use, so they are requiring languages of wider communication, or lingua francas. So, by way of a brief digression, in the 21st century, identity is very interesting. So, for example, you can identify by your clan. So I mentioned before the Gelum clan. You could identify as a Gelum. You could identify as your sub-tribe, as a Mashang. Or you could identify as a Tangsa. If you identified as a Gelum or a Mashang, for most other people even in other tribes not far away, that would be meaningless. So you'd have to say, I am a Tangsa. Further afield within India, saying you're a Tangsa won't help. You might say you're a Naga. Further afield in Australia, that won't help. So you say you're a citizen of India or Myanmar. And in recent times, these people who were earlier largely following various animist beliefs, many of them have become Christians. Some have become Buddhists. Some have adopted a sort of Hinduized version, codified kind of version of their traditional beliefs, kind of, and they may identify with that. These communities are not well adjusted to the idea of unity. Diversity is very important here. Okay, so a lingua franca, a language that is used for communication between different groups or people. It could be the native language of one of them, or it could be a language not natively spoken by anyone. So let's have a look at a particular case. So the case of Mulong and Malu. Now, I showed you a photo of a house in Mulong earlier, the one that has now been demolished by the coal company. And this is in a hill. This is the first hill of the range that is above the plains on the India side at a place called Lido. If anybody has studied the history of the Second World War, you'll know that Lido is the place from which the road to China began. Anyway, there are three villages on this hill that I'm familiar with. Malu, which is mostly populated by Hakun speakers. Mulong, which is mostly populated by Champang and Hakun speakers. And Mulong 2, which is populated by Hacheng. Now Hacheng, Champang and Hakun are all Tangsa languages, but they are all mutually unintelligible. However, Hacheng has become adopted as the lingua franca of this hill, so everybody understands Hacheng to some extent. However, more recently, since people have become more Christianized, they have adopted the languages of the church. So if they're Baptists, they're supposed to use Chamchang, which is not really understood by any of them. And if they are Presbyterians, they are supposed to use Tuglai. Now, Tuglai is quite similar to Hacheng. So if you were a Presbyterian in Mulong number 2 village, you'd have no difficulty understanding. But actually, Mulong number 2 is a Baptist village, and therefore people are required to use Chamchang in church, or at least for some parts of the service. Complicated, right? So what is a church? So a second case of lingua franca in a single village, a plains village, is Lakla at Jagun. Now, Lakla was originally in an area that 100 years ago was populated by Yongkok Nagas, Yongkok Tangsas. The Yongkok speak a very different language, but most of them have moved out, except for my friend Nong Yongkok, who has a house, very nice house, quite near to the village. I'm leaving him out of this discussion for the moment. The two main language varieties in the Lakla village, a more recently established one, is Ngaimong and Maitai. But the lingua franca of the village is Ngaimong. The village is divided between Presbyterians and Baptists. The Baptists still use Chamchang, and the Baptist school church is right next to the village. But the Presbyterians are now a majority there, and Tuglai is used, and it really is mutually intelligible with Ngaimong. So because nearly everyone in the village knows Ngaimong, they can more or less understand the Tuglai that is spoken in church. And there's a mission there as well, and Mizo, a completely unrelated language, is also used because of the presence of Mizo. Turning back to my first example, back on the hill, at Malupahar, which is the Hakun village, I have attended many church services there, and several times I would keep notes on what was happening. So the main language of the village is Hakun, but some of the people that attend the church, and it's a Baptist church, some of the people that attend church there are tea garden labourers, and for them it's necessary to speak Assamese. So the introduction was done in Assamese. The Bible reading was done in English, because although there is a Chamchang Bible, they can't understand it, and therefore they can't read it. Preaching was done in a combination of Hakun, the general language of the village, Assamese, the language of wider communication across the whole state, and Hacheng, which is the language of wider communication or lingua franca of that hill. Hymns, because they are Baptist, are required to be sung in Chamchang, and people actually don't know half the time what they're singing, which is curious considering that one of the purposes of the Protestant Reformation was that people would understand the Word of God, but there you go. But sometimes they have performances or special songs, and these are done in Sadri, or they were on the occasion that I was there, because they were performed by tea garden labourers who speak a Hindi, Assamese type Creole language called Sadri. Group prayers were either done in Assamese or in Chamchang. If they were out of the official prayer book, they were done in Chamchang. And private prayers, and the private prayers are something to behold in that community, are done only in people's own language. All out loud and done together. Okay, just to give you an idea of how different the various languages within Tangsa are, here are words in Muklom, Cholim and Champang. And you'll see that none of these are similar, although there are some connections. So, for example, the word for snake in Muklom and Cholim is Pu, carrying tone number 3, which sounds different in those two varieties. In Champang, they say Punu. The word for bee in Muklom is Na. The Cholim say Ny, and the Champang say Natnu. The word for pig is Vak in Muklom, Vak in Cholim, slightly different vowel, and Wakku in Champang. And what you can see here is that the Champang word is pretty much the same as the Muklom word, but with an extra bit added. But then it becomes a little bit more complicated as you go further down the list. And you can begin to see that, for example, the word for tiger, which is sh in Muklom, and ch in Cholim, and sappe in Champang, these will start to sound more different. And once you start to put together sentences, and there are also grammatical differences between these varieties, quite significant ones. Okay, it is interesting that the words are largely monosyllabic in Muklom, that means having a single syllable, and are largely two syllables in Champang. So community views about how languages relate to each other. Well, when a particular community that I worked with, the Yangban Vang, were asked about which varieties are most similar, they named Gatlon, Rura, Gaha, Gahi, Champang, Toke, Nahen, and Miku. Now, I told you there were 80 different varieties, and so therefore we've just had a whole lot of new names. And these varieties are all very similar to each other, are all very close to each other in their original villages. I won't go through all what I've written about this later on because I'm going to run out of time, but the thing about this is that you understand the varieties that are spoken close to you regardless of how similar they actually are. One of the groups mentioned there is Rira, marked as Rera on the on the map that we'll look at in a second. And I was just talking to my PhD student who is currently under lockdown in a Rira village in northeast India. And this is the map of those original villages. Hopefully you can see there are two Rara villages. There's one Rangse village, that's the original village where the that's there, where the Yangban Vang come from. Below that is Miku. On this other side here is Ratnu. And then there's two Gatlun villages. And that was the original pattern originally, one or two villages speaking their own language. Rangse is still there. Rara, however, has disappeared. And all the people speaking that language have either merged with a different group or shifted to India. As for writing, so writing, I mentioned earlier the script created by Lokum Mosang. That was in some time ago. Here is a story. This is actually the story about the loss of traditional writing, written in a Romanized script and the indigenous script. And the question here is, suppose you're going to agree with the policy that pretty much every government in the world has, that people have a right to education in their mother tongue. What scripts will you use? What spelling system will you use? Considering that most of these languages do not yet have a standardized spelling system. Which variety out of the 80 or so will be taught? If you teach one variety to children who speak another variety, are you teaching them their mother tongue? Not really. Teacher training in a polylingual situation in less developed countries is a challenge. And of course, children are being sent to towns for higher education in boarding school situations, and that's where lingua francas like Assamese and Nagamese, which is based on Assamese, are being used. And this is one of the things that is leading to language loss.